John's gospel says, when Jesus had spoken these words, he went out with his disciples across the brook Kidron, where there was a garden, which he and his disciples entered. Now Judas, who betrayed him, also knew the place, for Jesus often met them there with his disciples. So Judas, having procured a band of soldiers and some officers from the chief priests and the Pharisees, went there with lanterns and torches and weapons. Then Jesus, knowing all that would happen to him, came forward and said to them, "Whom do you seek?" They answered him, "Jesus of Nazareth." Jesus said to them, "I am he." Judas, who betrayed him, was standing with them. When Jesus said to them, "I am he," they drew back and fell to the ground. So he asked them again, "Whom do you seek?" And they said, "Jesus of Nazareth." Jesus answered, "I told you that I am he. So if you seek me, let these men go." This was to fulfill the word that he had spoken, "Of those whom you gave me, I have lost not one." Then Simon Peter, having a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant and cut off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. So Jesus said to Peter, "Put your sword into its sheath. Shall I not drink the cup that the Father has given me?" All right. Well, in our passage today, we move from where we've been for like the last 5 chapters, right? In the upper room with his disciples, again on that Passover night with Jesus teaching. And we move from the upper room, as we find, into into beginning, or what's commonly referred to as the Passion of the Christ, right? Which is basically these events leading up to his crucifixion. And there's 4 main events. There's his arrest, there's the trial, there's the crucifixion, then there's the resurrection. So the Passion is these first 3 events and that we're going to look at. Now, before we kind of dive into our passage here in John this morning, I want to kind of give some background or some general notes about this arrest of Jesus. You see, it's actually all 4 gospel writers record this arrest of Jesus. But as we spoke about when we got into John, even though we have these 4 gospels, they all differ in minor ways and differ in different ways. And especially John is the most different of all these gospels. And we talked about why that's so. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are sometimes called the synoptic gospel, and it's thought they used a lot of the same source material in bringing together their record of Jesus. Whereas John wrote his gospel later, so he would have these records at his disposal. And John wanted to write his gospel for a very specific purpose that I'll remind you of in a moment. But he also didn't necessarily talk about every event that the other gospels talked about, but enhanced or brought more detail into some of the events, brought it out of what happened that helps support his purpose. For example, some of these changes and these differences, and the reason I want to tell you this is because you've probably heard about the arrest of Jesus and you're like, wait a minute, why aren't we talking about this? Well, because it's not in John. For example, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, right before Jesus' arrest, you have this beautiful moment where Jesus is praying here in the Garden of Gethsemane, and he has that prayer, "Not your will, if this cup can pass from me, not your will, but thine be done." And John doesn't include that, but John does reference it in verse 11 where he says to Peter, "Shall not this cup pass from me that the Father has for me to do?" So he kind of references it. That's basically saying, yes, this did happen. Some other things that Matthew, Mark, and Luke include that John doesn't is this Judas kiss. And we always talk about the Judas kiss, right? And this act of betrayal when Judas comes up and kisses Jesus. And John doesn't necessarily mention that, but John deals with the betrayal extensively back in the upper room, if you remember what he's talking about, the one who would betray him. So John doesn't feel he needs to hash that to bring that out. And then only Luke tells us that Jesus healed the man who had his ear cut off. And only Luke brings that out. Again, Luke talks a lot about the miracles of Jesus, so it would be figure for him too. But the other gospel writers write a lot of the miracles of Jesus, so it wasn't necessarily necessary to talk about every miracle. So they want to get to the purpose of all this. And then John is unique in that he includes the names, a couple of names that aren't included in the other accounts. For example, he names Peter as the swordsman, and he names Malchus as the servant or the victim, the ear loss victim. right? So he mentions their names, and there's a reason why he mentions their names. Peter he mentions because he wants us to remember Peter because Peter's soon going to deny Jesus, and he wants that Peter's humanness and his realness to come forth of saying, Peter's far from perfect, and that's why he's so relatable. And he mentions Malchus. Many believe he mentions Malchus because Malchus becomes a believer most believe Malchus became a believer in Jesus and became a leader in the early church in Jerusalem. So as John's writing this, a lot of his readers would know this guy. So he mentions his name. He's like, hey, that's you. Let me see your ear, or whatever. So he kind of mentions those things. But the most important thing is that John is writing his account to achieve the purpose with which he's writing in his gospel. And you remember his purpose that he says in chapter 20, that is that we may believe Jesus is the Christ, and in believing have life in his name. Not only that, trusting Jesus changes us and saving us, and we have eternity, but also changing us and changing the way in which we live our very lives because we trust him. So what John brings out in all of this kind of helps support this. And again, this is kind of the first of these three events of the Passion that includes the arrest, the trial, and the crucifixion of Jesus. And it all marks, Jesus, or marks God's work through Jesus of paying the penalty for sin, this salvation and forgiveness of sin. But you know what's also interesting in this? And as you read these events, something comes out in this, is that basically these three events also offer us a summary of mankind's rebellion against God. In fact, the sin of mankind and the need for a Savior is very clear and summed up in the actions of man in these three accounts. So we get to see all of sin on display through these three events, which is kind of interesting because as we see all of man's rebellion and this need for a Savior, basically what also we see through these events is man's struggle to trust God. And each in a different way. Each of these events shows a different one of these struggles. For example, today we look at the arrest of Jesus, and within this is our struggle to trust God's power, to trust that He is big enough and is enough for us to trust. And because we struggle with that, sometimes we take matters into our own hands, don't we? And try to do things in our own strength, while Jesus is presented here as sufficient. And then in Jesus' trial, which we'll look at next week and for the next few weeks, it's our struggle to trust God's authority. And the idea of truth comes up. And because we have struggled with this, we tend to want to manipulate what's true to get what we want, while Jesus and his will is most important. And that's what comes out through that. And then through Jesus' crucifixion, it kind of highlights our struggle to trust God's work, and that he knows what he's doing, and he is going to give us the path and lead us where we need to go and what we need to do. And when we struggle this, instead of trusting that, we want to go our own way and find our own way and do things our own way to accomplish. And we just basically say, hey, the means justify the ends justify the means. So we got there, but did we do it God's way? And so that's what comes out in this, that Jesus is the way. So that's what we're going to look at over these next 6 weeks. We're going to look at these three events. But today we're going to look at the arrest of Jesus. So let's dive into that and dive back into the message. So if you have your Bibles open, I want to walk us through this event, this arrest of Jesus, to see how it kind of highlights that struggle to trust God's power and what that means and what it's shown in Jesus. So if you look at verse 1 and 2, verse 1 and 2 kind of set the stage for this. It kind of gives us the setting for this arrest of Jesus and explains where they are and why they are where they are. Okay, it says, and it talks about that Jesus and the 11 disciples, they leave the upper room. They're in Jerusalem. Remember, Jerusalem's on a mount. It's on a big hill. And it says they go down into a valley where there's a brook called Kidron. This is the Kidron Valley, which is on the east side of Jerusalem. And then a few miles outside of Jerusalem, they go back up a hill. And that hill, John doesn't mention the name, but we learn from the other Gospels, it's called the Mount of Olives. And on this hill, there's a garden there. which John talks about, but we know that as the Garden of Gethsemane. So that's where they are. So they leave the upper room, they go through this valley and up this hill. It's a couple-mile trip that they make. Now, what's interesting about this valley, this Kidron Valley, and this brook that it mentions, and why does it mention a brook? Because there would be a brook that would flow during certain times of the year, especially in the spring, which is when this is, during Passover. And it was also said about this brook, because it flowed down from Jerusalem, and that's where the Temple Mount was, that during the Passover season, oftentimes the water would be stained red because of all the temple sacrifices, the lambs that were sacrificed for Passover. So just kind of imagine that, Jesus walking through this brook on his way to his arrest, through this blood-stained water, and the symbolism of all that as Jesus is walking through that. It's pretty wild, isn't it? But anyway, so that's where they are. And we also learn from verse 2, this was some place that Jesus frequented with his disciples, right? It was a known place. Possibly they met there for prayer a lot or for teaching. This is where Jesus would do some teaching. But the idea is Judas was familiar with this place, and he knew that Jesus would be there. Now, here's the point of John giving this setting. Jesus is not hiding. Remember, Jesus knows he's going to be arrested. Now, you watch shows like Cop. What happens if somebody knows they did something bad? They hide. Jesus isn't hiding. He's not like hiding in these trees and things like that. He goes to a place that everybody knows he goes to, or those that know him knows he goes to, and knows exactly where he's going to be. So Jesus isn't hiding here. He's not trying to avoid his arrest or anything like that. And that's important to realize with all of what we see that happens next. Because what follows now, as we have this stage set, are 3 little short scenes, or 3 snapshots that describe this arrest, but also in each of these little snapshots, it reveals a way that we all tend to struggle with trusting God's power, or we struggle that we want to be in control of how things go. So trusting God's power in our life, and how Jesus shows himself or demonstrates himself then more than powerful enough and worthy of our trust. So in each of these snapshots, there's a little theme to it. And John kind of breaks it up like this so that we can understand this is who Jesus is. So again, he's presenting Jesus, so he doesn't want to just give us an event, but he wants to also present Jesus so that we can believe in him and find life in his name. So as we look at this, starting in verse 3, we find that Judas comes, and it says Judas procured a band of soldiers and some officers from the chief priests. So these are Roman soldiers, and these are like the temple police guys that he gets. So he's got Jewish authorities and he's got Roman authorities with him. It's kind of like he brings the local police force and the National Guard. And this is no small group of people. Oftentimes when we think of the arrest of Jesus, we think of this small little band of merry men, maybe 10 guys or something like this. This word that we see here, band, if you look at what the original language talks about, the word band is the same word that's used for a Roman cohort. And here's what a Roman cohort is. It's a company of soldiers numbering anywhere between 200 and 600 men. Let that sink in. Okay? So if John's getting this and he's saying, so he's here with this cohort of soldiers and these temple police force that's coming, and they're armed to the teeth, right? It says they're armed with clubs and torches and weapons, okay, and lanterns. So imagine this force, almost like a small army coming from Jerusalem and then up this valley as you see the lights coming up into the garden. I mean, it would overwhelm anybody you see this coming, right? You're like, oh my goodness, what is going on? They're coming to arrest one man. So imagine this. It should have overwhelmed everybody. But Jesus really isn't all that overwhelmed. And that's one of the things we see. Because look how Jesus, what he did in the face of all this. First of all, it says that he knew all this was coming. Okay, verse 4, he knew all this was about to happen. So Jesus goes and stands before them all. And he says, who do you seek? So imagine this. Okay, Jesus is coming, this crowd, this huge force is coming to look for Jesus. And again, he's not hiding. In fact, he stands up in front of them and says, who are you looking for? Yeah, he's not out on the lam hiding behind a tree saying, don't find me. He comes right out in front and stands before them. Who are you looking for? They say, Jesus of Nazareth, which would be his common name. They don't say, Jesus the Christ, or Jesus who claims he's the Christ, which is showing what they believed. So they're just looking for some guy, right? And Jesus of Nazareth. And then look how Jesus answers. He says, I am he. Now, he really doesn't answer like this. He really doesn't say this. This is the way we translate it into English. But if you look at the literal translation of how Jesus answers, he doesn't say, I am he. He says, I am. Now, you might recognize that phrase. Why? Because that is a phrase that God speaks about himself as saying, I am the God of the universe. I am the Lord God Almighty. In fact, John talks about Jesus using those I am phrases many times in John. You remember where Jesus talks about I am, and he says, I am the bread of life. I am the good shepherd. I am living water. I am the resurrection and the life. I am the light of the world. But it's back in the Old Testament that we really see this as speaking of God, because you remember when God came to Moses in the burning bush out in the wilderness, and he says to Moses, I want you to go and I want you to go tell Pharaoh, let my people go. And Moses is like, whoa, you just want me to do that? Who should I say sent me? And God says, tell him I am sent you. Again, the God of the universe, the God, a creator of all things. So what Jesus is saying here is, I'm God. Looking for Jesus of Nazareth? I am. Now, we may say, well, that didn't seem like much. But those that were there, it was a lot to. It struck them. They got the sense of what he was saying. He's speaking of his power and his person as God in the flesh, right? And it's such a powerful statement that look at verse 6. It says, when they heard of it, they drew back and they fell to the ground. So they're all coming. They're armed. They're like, we're ready to go. This guy comes before him. He says, who are you looking for? We're looking for this guy. And he says, I am. And they all go, okay. They're not shocked in the way of just saying, I can't believe you said that. What they are is they're floored because they're like, what have we just done? If you've ever seen any of those Instagram memes, it would say, at this moment, they realized that they messed up. It was at this moment they're like, wait a minute. This isn't just some guy. They could have taken 10,000 soldiers up into this garden to take Jesus, and they wouldn't have been able to take him if Jesus didn't want to be taken, if he wanted to resist. There was no way they could have taken Jesus. Basically, they bring a knife to a gunfight. Yet in their rebellion and their refusal to trust God and to see Jesus as the Christ, wanting to be in control, they think they could get what they want through their effort, through their force, through their power. So that's why they bring all of that. And they quickly discover, we can't. And it's in this first kind of snapshot that we discover that the arrest of Jesus, it reveals an all-powerful God that we can trust because, first of all, Jesus is bigger. This is what John is saying. You want to learn about the arrest of Jesus? Here's what we learned through it. Jesus is bigger. Jesus is bigger than anything or anyone else. Have you ever been that? Have you ever struggled with wanting to be in control? Wanting to do things in your own effort, your own strength? Probably just me, but I'll just talk about that then. Now, we all struggle with that, right? And hopefully we can relate to that. You know, we say, well, I want to trust God, sure. But then you face a situation in your life, right? And it's big. Maybe it's an attack against you, or maybe it's some financial hit or a health hit that you can't control, or maybe it's a problem that needs to be overcome and a situation needs to change. But instead of trusting God for it, to bring about relief or an answer or to change things, we take matters into our own hands. And we try to manipulate. Maybe we go on the attack. Maybe we try to defend ourselves. And we get caught up in all of this stuff of trying to make it happen on our own. Does that sound familiar? It does for me. And sometimes we do this when we struggle because we're not trusting that Jesus is powerful and we're not trusting his power. Maybe we try to manipulate the situation, or we try really hard, but the thing is, we go forward in our own efforts rather than trusting God. And at the heart of this struggle, or this thinking that we have, is that God isn't big enough to handle my situation. He's not powerful enough to meet us at our point of need. Or maybe he's not enough to shape someone's opinion of us, or to change somebody's heart, or to supply a need, or to bring about a change. And here what we see is these men, they thought they could overpower Jesus. If they just had enough force and numbers, were intimidating enough, they could defeat Jesus. Yet in 2 words, they're cut down, aren't they? They're at Jesus' mercy. All of a sudden, these guys who are thinking they're going to come and control the situation, they lost control of the situation. Jesus is now in control of his arrest. And again, that's very important. Again, he never hiding in the first place. So we look at this arrest not as mankind beating Jesus, but that Jesus accomplishing what he wants to accomplish. Because he is all powerful, right? So in these 2 words, they're at his mercy. And this arrest, it wasn't in their control. All that was going to happen and was happening was under God's control. And it's what he allows. In fact, that's what we learn about Jesus, right? In that he's bigger. In fact, Paul says this: for by him, by Jesus, all things were created in heaven and earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or authorities, all things were created through him and for him. He's before all things, so that in him all things hold together. If all things hold together in him, if he created all things, if he's the God who creates and sustains all things, the God who makes all of that happen and even stills the storms, as we just sung about, then isn't he enough, or isn't he powerful to take care of us and meet us at our point of need and in our situations? Jesus is bigger than any obstacle, problem, need, or conflict that we have or may ever face. So here's what John is saying, first and foremost, through the arrest of Jesus, is that his power is worth trusting because he is bigger than anything we could imagine. And he's big enough. Now, verse 7, it goes on. Scene continues to play out. As there's this awkward silence, as guys are picking themselves off the ground, Jesus again stands before them and says, "Who do you seek?" Again, he's taking control of this situation, isn't he? And they said, "Jesus of Nazareth." And Jesus tells them, again, "I'm he," or "I am." And then he does something interesting there. He says, "I've told you I'm he, so if you seek me, let these men go." Now we read that and we say, well, Jesus is asking them to protect these guys or not to harm the disciples. No, he's not. He's telling them to not harm the disciples. What Jesus is doing is Jesus is making the terms now of his arrest. Again, these guys think they're in control, and Jesus goes, no, this is how it's going to happen. If you're going to take me, you're not hurting them. You're not to touch these guys. You see, the verb that's used here for let these men go is in the imperative, which is a command. So he's commanding them, let them go. You're going to let them go. And verse 9 says he did this to fulfill the word that he had spoken. Of those whom you gave me, I have lost not one. So Jesus is in complete control here. Nothing will happen that he doesn't either make happen or allow. And again, so he said this because of something he had said earlier that had to be true for him to be all-powerful, because everything he says is true, and everything that he says and puts about will happen. So we look at what he says here, of those you've gave me, I have lost no one. Back in John chapter 6, as Jesus is talking to the crowds, he says this in verse 9, "And this is the will of him who sent me, that I should lose nothing of all that he has given me, but raise it up on the last day." Again, Jesus said, no, and that nobody will touch this. And later on in chapter 10, when he's talking about him as the good shepherd, and he talks about that the Father has given me these sheep, these sheep, and he's given them to me, and he's greater than all, and no one is able to snatch them out of my hands. So what is this talking about here then? Well, what Jesus says goes. If he says he will provide and protect, then you know what? He will. You see, Jesus, our all-powerful God, revealed through this arrest, he's not just bigger than anything, he's also better. He's also better than anything. His power is also seen not only in being over everything, but in everything he does, he accomplishes. And everything he sets out to do, and everything that he sets out to do is perfectly good. Like protecting those that are his. He is faithful to always do what he sets out to do, which includes caring for his own. He's able to protect and provide for those that are his own. Think about this. There's 12 guys here against up to 600 guys. You think these disciples, if those guys wanted to arrest them or to beat them, they could have done it very easily? Sure, they could have. Why didn't they? Because Jesus steps in and says, you're not touching them. Isn't that interesting? You see, Jesus does that with us as his own. Nobody can touch us because he says, I'm going to protect. I'm going to protect and provide for my own. Have you ever doubted that? Have you ever doubted that God would protect and provide for you? I know I've had times where you struggle with that, right? And you doubt that and you have a need and you're just like, well, God doesn't care. And so then we get consumed with worry, don't we? We get consumed with worry and making sure that we protect ourselves or provide what we can. And you know what all of that does? Is it takes us away from focusing on him. It makes us get consumed with something that Jesus said he's going to take care of and that he's put in place. And yeah, we can follow it and be responsible, but yet he says, I'm in charge of that so that you can be free to follow me. You know, one time when Jesus was speaking to the crowds in the Sermon on the Mount, he was talking to them about this kind of thing, about God's provision and not to worry. And he's talking about, the trees of the field and the birds and all of these things and how God cares for them. And he's urging them. He says, don't be anxious. Trust God's power to provide. So he tells them in Matthew 6, if God clothes the grass of the field, which today is alive and tomorrow is thrown into the oven, will he not much more clothe you, O you of little faith? And he says, don't worry then about these things. Rather than worry about these things, here's what God desires for us. Seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness. And all these things will be added to you. God will take care of them. So that God wants to take care of these things and he wants to be powerful in our lives and us to trust him in that so that we're free to follow him. We're free to cling to him. So he's saying, you know what? I want to free you. And so this is God's power and Jesus cares for us. He protects and he provides just as he does here with his disciples. No harm would come to them. Even though maybe they wouldn't have believed it in the moment, as we're going to see with Peter right after this, and some of his other disciples, which we can do, can't we? God tells us he's going to provide, and the next day we're worrying again. But he says, you don't need to struggle with this. However, John's showing us that through Jesus, we don't need to worry or fear. Jesus has us and is able to provide and protect us. And he will. And again, the disciples show that maybe they still struggle with this as we see what happens next. Look at verse 10. It talks about Simon Peter having a sword, drew it, and struck the high priest's servant and cut off his right ear. Now we learn in Luke that two of the disciples had swords. Simon the Zealot and Simon Peter had swords. And maybe they had them for protection or whatever need. But here, actually, I think it's Luke notes that the other disciples even said to Jesus, should we bear our swords at this point? But here John only mentions Peter, because Peter's the only one who actually does and wield damage. And Peter takes out his sword and he strikes the high priest's servant, right? It cuts off his ear. Now, in a way, maybe we admire Peter for his bravery here. I mean, one guy against 600 guys, and he's going to take them on to protect Jesus, kind of suicidal thing. But we also look at Peter here and say, he didn't attack a soldier here. He didn't attack one of the guys that was armed, was he? Did he? He did some high priest servant who's just kind of sitting there on the side. He's like, I'll get you. You know, but he cuts off his ear, and maybe it's a sign that Peter's, brave and great, and, he will fight. But basically what's happening here is the idea is that Peter jumps in thinking Jesus needs his help. I'm here to help you, Jesus. I'll come alongside you. Jesus, you're in trouble. I'll protect you. Yet look how Jesus responds. He doesn't respond with a thank you or well done, Peter, or wow, that was awesome. Appreciate the effort. He doesn't say that. He says, put away your sword, Peter. Don't you think I have to drink of this cup? Or don't you think I need to do this? I'm the one in charge here. What's going to happen is what I need to do. Don't you think? So basically, he's saying, don't you think I can handle this? Did you ever say that? Did you ever kind of go to God, and maybe that's God's answer to us? Don't you think I got this? Well, it's here we discover that our all-powerful God in the flesh, Jesus, isn't just bigger and better, but Jesus is enough. And that's what John's telling us here. We can trust his power because Jesus is enough. Jesus is powerful enough to bring about his will on his own. He doesn't need our help. Do you know that? Listen to that again. God doesn't need our help. God isn't sitting there saying, oh, I hope so-and-so comes around because I'll be lost without that. I won't be able to accomplish anything without that. God doesn't need our help. Now, God includes us in his work as a blessing for us that we get included in his work, but he's going to do what he's going to do, and he's always going to do what he's going to do. And he's perfectly capable of accomplishing his will apart from our help. Yet, I don't know about you, but how many times do we do that? Do we want to come alongside and say, all right, God, you need a little help. You're not working quite fast enough, God, so I got to step in and get things rolling. We step in and we try to manipulate a situation. Or maybe we walk down a path that we said, well, this one looks good. So I know you probably would have sent me down here, so I'm going to go down here. But in reality, it's not where he wanted to send us. He wanted us to wait. But yet we think we're helping him. And we go ahead of him. Or maybe we make a bad decision based on what we think we should have or he would want us to have. And he's like, no, I've got this. Just trust me. Trust my timing and trust what I'm going to do. Yet oftentimes we kind of struggle with that, don't we? And maybe God has us where we are for a reason and has us waiting or has us in a difficult situation. Sometimes we get in difficult situations and we're like, oh, God, I can help you get out of this. Help you get me out of this. And God's like, no, I want you there. I'm going to use you there. Or I'm going to grow you there. I have you there for a reason. Abraham and Sarah kind of struggled with this same kind of struggle that God is enough, or Jesus is enough. Remember, God told Abraham, you're going to have many descendants. Abraham's getting older, and he's like, I got nobody. My wife is barren. This isn't going to happen, God. You know what? We got a servant. Why don't we just do it through them? And has a kid through Sarah's servant, whose name is Ishmael. Do you know to this day, that is the thorn in the side of the nation of Israel, are the descendants of Ishmael. That's man's way. God says, I have my way. You see, sometimes we think God needs our help. Again, we can partake in his will, but not to bring about what we want. We can't rush God's work. We can't manipulate his will to fit our agenda. God in his power works how he wants, when he wants, and how he wants to do it through us. And do we trust him enough, or trust him to be enough? James talks about that. And he says, let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing. Take your hands off. When you trust God with something, take your hands off. Now, he will lead you, and he'll show you he'll lead you, and things you can do and you can walk in. But don't try to take matters into your own hands saying, all right, God, you didn't tell me this, but I think I need to do that. I think you need a little help. Or I think you missed a little bit here. I need to be married by this date. So I think you're missing that. So I better go and do that because you need my help. I got to fix this for you. Here through this whole incident with Peter, Jesus saying, no, I am enough. It's my will. You don't have to jump in. I never needed your help. I'm in control here. Everything that's happening right now is because I'm allowing it or I want it. And this needs to happen. So that's what we get across in that. Jesus is enough to handle what he needs to accomplish. Trust him. So, while the arrest of Jesus, it's kind of a horrible event because you're looking at that and saying, oh man, this is going to go in a bad path here. And it takes to the path of the cross. It also reveals to us in this way this struggle to trust his power in our lives. And again, in this we struggle with our futility to control things that God alone is big enough and powerful enough to control. So this arrest shows that while we think we're taking control, we're not. Jesus is always in control. And in complete control. Nothing surprises him, nothing overtakes him, nothing thwarts him. He will always accomplish what he sets out to do, not only for himself, but in our lives. So this morning, where are you struggling with this? Where are you struggling right now in your life with this? To trust that God is big enough, that he's powerful enough to work. To trust that he knows what he's doing and that he has our best in mind. You see, when we face situations that seem too big, too bad, or too impossible, they're nothing for Jesus. Because he's bigger than anything we could possibly face, better than we can imagine in his care for us, and he is enough to accomplish what he needs or desires to do. He is worthy of our trust. And I want to leave you with this. As I was reading through this, and again, we can struggle with this in our own lives, can't we? And in our struggle for this, maybe it's job-related, or maybe it's our life and our future as we're looking to our future and saying, am I trusting you with this? Maybe it's a crisis we're facing. Maybe it's here at church. That's one question we need to ask ourselves. Are we trusting God with our church? Is he big enough and powerful enough to work here amongst us and through us? Or do we want to control it and make it happen? How are we going to trust his leading and then follow him? But as I work through this arrest of Jesus and this idea of control and wanting to control what can't be controlled because only Jesus can control those things, I kept thinking back to an incident we had with Rachel. One year we were down in Hatteras at the beach, and when Rachel was younger, and she's not a huge fan of the ocean. And I remember her one time, she's looking at the ocean, and waves down there come in real powerful. And I remember Rachel standing in front of the waves and looking at them and just getting mad. And a wave came in and she goes, "Stop!" Just as the wave kind of washed in on her. And there's no way she's stopping that wave. So I want to leave you with this as we kind of keep this in mind. Is this message this morning through the arrest of Jesus. Why try to control the seas when we can just trust their maker? And that's really what's behind this arrest of Jesus and what it's teaching us. Why try to control what we can never really control when we can trust the one who is? May God bless us as we look at this and as we trust him more today. Let's pray.